Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be updating the power rankings once again for Survivor 42 following episode 3, and obviously this was a pretty fun episode. I mean, it was pretty crazy with the tribal and also some of the edgic stuff going on. I'm really happy to break it all down, but as usual, we'll be ranking all the players in the game based on how likely I think it is that they'll win from this point. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into it. So starting at the list at number 15, we have the boot from this week. We have Jenny, and it's sort of crazy to see her go out here. In episode 3, she has a confessional about losing the challenge and being scared about Chanel being on the summit. Obviously with her also being on the summit earlier on. He's also concerned about Mike not voting, so she wants Chanel to protect her vote. Tells Mike she wants to vote out Lydia, but ultimately at Tribal, while Daniel does vote with their side at first, he ultimately flips during the deadlock, resulting in her being voted out. And overall, it isn't too surprising based on this episode that generally was going home. However, I was a bit surprised before the episode. If someone had told me that she'd be the next boot over Lydia, then I certainly thought that would have been a bit more surprising. Speaking more generally, with her premiere arguably being circumstantial and her episode 2 not being great, however, it's not too surprising that she was an early boot. Now, I did say that she had promised early on, largely due to Erica's edit from 41, and I thought this season was going to have that type of winner, that Jenny fits the bill pretty well. But to see her being a pre-merge boot here isn't the most shocking thing in the world if we're considering previous seasons into account. And like I said, the episode itself did a good job at establishing that Jenny was a potential boot there. Now, gameplay-wise, I don't think she was in the worst position in the world. She had a very solid ally in Mike and Daniel, wanted to keep her over Lydia. While it's not great that she was the initial target by the Hai and Lydia duo, I feel like if the 6 people on Body all got the vote, Jenny probably stays over Lydia. So to that end, I think she kind of gets screwed over, but at the end of the day, I'm not too sure how likely it is that she wins even if she gets through that round. She doesn't really come off as the most cutthroat or most active player in the world to me. And while she does have Mike there, it's not guaranteed that she would beat Mike if she gets to the end with him, or just in general. So at the end of the day, while I do think she kind of gets screwed over by all the twists coming into play, I don't think she really is a contender from a pure gameplay perspective. I wasn't too high on her in the preseason. And while I thought she had some potential edgically based on what we saw in 41, it's not too surprising to see her go out here. So she's here at number 15. And with that, we are now moving to the 14 people still in the game. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how lucky I think it is that they'll win, largely based on their edit, but also based on their current game position. But at number 14, and I guess as a sneak peek, the bottom 3 people are all Ika members. And it's sort of crazy how Ika didn't get any content in this episode, really. I mean, you'd expect there to be like a camp scene or something before them, but they didn't even get that. And for whatever reason, they didn't even get someone to go on the summit, which I found very weird, but that's just how it is. And I mean, it doesn't really do much at the end of the day to change my perception of them, as obviously Ika doesn't really have too many strong contenders at the end of the day, especially after the first 2 episodes. And obviously with this, it doesn't help any of their cases, obviously. But like I said, the bottom 3 are going to be all Ika members. So obviously it's just a matter of figuring out who the bottom 3 are. And I've been stalling long enough. At number 14, I decided to go with Roxroy. And I know it's sort of crazy to put Roxroy all the way at the bottom, as I feel like he did have a storyline set up in the premiere to potentially adapt more as time goes on, but we've seen pretty much no follow-up to that in these following 2 episodes. And even outside that, I'm not feeling too great about him at the end of the day. I mean, he did mention Tori's name, but aside from that, we haven't really heard much from him. And I feel like if we're comparing him to the other 2 Ika members that fill out this bottom rank, I feel like Roxroy has the most potential to be an early boot for me. I mean, that's the main thing that keeps him at the bottom here. While he does have a bit more of a storyline set up compared to the other 2, it's not looking great for him at the end of the day. I just feel like he's more likely to be an early boot than all the other people on Ika, which again, not great. So because of that, I'm here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and again, we're sticking with the Ika tribe, and it's sort of crazy how far this person has really fallen over these last couple of weeks in my power rankings. But at number 13, we have Romeo, and I know it's crazy. I had Romeo number 2 in week 1, He fell to number 9 last week, and obviously now he's here at number 13. And again, I still think there's some potential for him, like with him talking early on about him being a pageant coach. But really, like when we're looking at the Ika tribe, it's just not looking great for him at all. Plus, one thing I noted is that, like I said, he doesn't get any content along with most of the Ika tribe, with the one exception being that he once again sat out of the immunity challenge. And to me, that isn't the best look at the end of the day. It sort of suggests that he's one of the weaker people physically on that tribe. And I could see that being used against him if they end up going to tribal again at some point. So it's not looking great for him either. Now, like Rockstar, I think he has a bit more potential to slide through the game, but I feel like at the end of the day, he's just not been getting the edit I feel like he should. Plus, I feel like Ika in general could be set up to be picked off pretty quickly, if I'm being perfectly honest. I feel like none of them really scream out to me as top contenders, and Romeo didn't really help his case here either, so he's here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and again, we're sticking with Ika here, and here we have Tori, and now the main reason I have Tori above these other two is that I feel like she will at least make it to the merge, if not being the merge boot. And I feel like that's more that I can say for Rockstar or Romeo, where yes, they do have some potential to make it deep into the game, but I could also very easily see them being pre-merge boots. Tori is someone who I think at least has enough of a story to get to the merge, even if I feel like she's likely to be the merge boot of the season. So like I feel like that just certainty is enough to have her here. But at the end of the day, she's not winning the game. And again, I feel like Ika is going to be hard for me to believe that someone from Ika is going to win the game for me. And with Tori being in that group, that definitely harms her case. And with her getting no content, can't have her too high. So because of that, Ivory here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11. And we're finally talking about someone from another tribe and someone who actually got some content here. But we actually had the person who I thought would have been the boot coming into this episode. We have Lydia. And this was not a great episode for Lydia here. Now, she obviously sits out the immunity challenge with Daniel. After the challenge, she has a confession about how persuasive Daniel is. She's confident that the four of them will stick together to vote out Jenny. Obviously, her, Hai, Daniel, and Chanel being an alliance, supposedly. And while she's the main target by the majority of the members, the combination of Mike and Chanel losing their votes causes a tie. And with Hai staying firm and keeping her, she stays in the game over Jenny. And overall, this was not a great episode for Lydia. Now, I said last week that I thought Lydia was in a bad spot and could have been the first boot off Vadi if they went to tribal. And this episode seems to confirm that notion, or at least in the sense that she was in a bad position and was looked at as a target, although the vote ended up working out for her by the end. With Daniel blowing up his game and Mike being weakened, I think Lydia and Hai are in a decent position after this tribal, with them essentially being the center of the tribe. Now with that said, I don't think Lydia is winning. She doesn't get that much credit for saving herself, with Hai really taking center stage strategically, obviously in the lead up to the vote, and even at tribal where obviously he's the one in the position to break the deadlock. Obviously Lydia didn't really have much to do there. And even with her basically now being in a pretty good position, this episode didn't really do much to increase her win equity. I still don't think she's winning, so because of that, Ivory here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have probably the center character of this episode, and definitely someone who dropped off quite a lot from last week. And here we have Daniel. And obviously this was a pretty terrible episode for Daniel, both gameplay wise and even edgically. So in episode 3, he loses his shoes. Apparently this is a recurring thing for him. Has a confession about feeling good, explains a duo dynamic on Vati. He says he and Chanel are in the middle while knowing that Mike has an idol. Even so, he wants to learn more, as a lawyer, what the idol rules are. While Mike calls him neurotic, he gets to know anyway. It's there he finds out that the idols don't expire if they vote out Mike, so he says that Mike is lucky, as he'll now keep him in the game. He tries to give the idol back to Mike, only for the note to be missing. He then helps Mike find it. Turns out he dropped it on the way to giving it back and says Mike was right in saying it was missing. He calls it a classic Daniel Strunk moment of failure, which is something. He once again sets out of the immunity challenge. Afterwards, talks to Hai and Lydia about the Jenny plan. He then approaches Mike and Jenny about the Jenny plan. Has a confessional about how he prefers Lydia to go out as he's less close to her, but Mike can't vote, so it complicates the situation. He says Chanel will be key to how he votes. Has a confessional explain the split vote plan, or at least some of them at least. And then we get the tribal where he votes for Lydia in an effort to stick with the Mike and Jenny side. However, this and Chanel's no vote result in a tie. He then votes for Lydia on the revote, which, along with Chanel's no vote, results in a deadlock. And ultimately, this puts him in a pretty bad spot as it exposes to his alliance of Hai and Lydia that he turned on them. He opens the discussion by saying he doesn't want to go to Rocks, which isn't great as it immediately gives all the leverage to Hai, who wants Lydia to stay. And ultimately, Daniel flips, sending out Jenny. And overall, and many people have already commented on this was not a good episode for Daniel at all. Granted, a lot of that was due to Chanel's no vote and her not being open about it, putting him in that bad spot. He doesn't get his way with him saying he'd rather see Lydia go, only for Lydia to stay. And through his role in the vote, he damages all of his relationships. Now, as mentioned earlier, he sketches out Hai and Lydia through his attempt to vote out Lydia. He throws Chanel under the bus during the deadlock by blaming her for his Lydia vote, damaging that relationship. And by him flipping to vote out Jenny, he upsets Mike a lot, who was already nervous about him and was kind of upset about the losing the idol clue earlier on in the episode. Even beyond Tribal, he's undermined multiple times in the episode. Literally the first scene at Vati establishes that he loses things all the time, which is followed up by him losing Mike's idol, even after citing that he's a lawyer. There's Mike noting how he isn't fully comfortable with Daniel, a perception that Daniel reinforces through the idol mishap later with Tribal. And then there's Daniel undermining himself between his confessional about the Daniel Strunk moment of failure and his speech during Tribal where he says he's going to lose the game, where he points to his relationships with Mike and Chanel that are later damaged, and also hints to Hai that Daniel is closer to Mike on that side of the vote, which is a big reason why Hai flips his vote to cause a tie in the first place. So even that's not good gameplay-wise. So overall, it's a pretty big mess for Daniel, and obviously one of the biggest things he could have done was to flip on the revote if he was fully committed to avoiding the situation. Obviously, it's not great that he would be voting out Jenny in that situation, but at least if he had flipped on the revote, avoided the deadlock, he could have at least minimized the damage. Instead, while he does do the correct thing in avoiding Rocks and sending Jenny out, he does it in a way that really burns his relationships and really makes him like the biggest target coming into the next Tribal. So like I said, it's not looking great, and it's really crazy how after 2 episodes of mostly positive content, we have this episode that completely dunks on him. I'm not sure where his edit is going right now, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think there are tons of comparisons to JD's edit from last season, where both of them, did get plenty of positivity in there, but obviously they played very messy in the pre-merge. So if that's the case, then that suggests Daniel will be a pre-merge boot. And given his current game position, that isn't out of the realm of possibility. Now, I think he'll try to rebuild his relationships with Mike and Chanel, but it's pretty clear he's in a bad situation. If Vati were to go back to Tribal, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Daniel's voted out, though I'm very curious to see if he is able to rebound after this point. I mean, it's just so crazy how he got all this positivity in the first 2 episodes and how a lot of his quirkiness was being construed as positives, but now we just have an episode like this and it's absolutely crazy. So, I mean, I had reason to put him so high, even though I wasn't super confident in him, but I feel like this episode was enough to really knock him down, and I did consider putting him a little bit higher, maybe around like the 8 or 9 spot, but after thinking about some more, I feel like this was probably the best spot for him. And again, I'm very curious to see how he responds to this, but it is not looking great for him. The fact that his edit was entirely negative in this episode when it could have been portrayed positively is a big knock to his edit and his winning chances. But, like when you compare him to people like Rockstar and Romeo, who literally got 0 content in this episode, I figure it is enough to leave him a bit higher, number 10. Plus, like those first 2 episodes, I can't completely ignore. So because of that, I have him here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone who's actually pretty similar to Daniel in a lot of ways. In fact, they were aligned with him before this last episode. We have Chanel, and I also feel like Chanel had a pretty bad episode here. In episode 3, she selected to go on the summit, has a confessional about possibly building cross-travel bonds but not being there for the scramble. On the summit, talks to Omar about the prisoner's dilemma, has a confessional about liking Omar and how they hope to both get an advantage or playing it safe, depending on how things go. She speculates that Omar will play it safe, making her think that she can risk her vote. Ultimately, she risks her vote, but because Omar also risks his vote, she is unable to vote at this tribal. Upon returning to camp, she knows that Mike being unable to vote could complicate things. Daniel greets her and he explains the situation. She suggests splitting the vote between Mike and Jenny. As others note how nervous she is, she has a confessional about how she's been preparing for this moment. She hopes her social game will prevail despite her potentially not having a vote. At Tribal, she lies about protecting her vote from the summit when actually she risked it, and the truth comes out later when obviously she learns that she had lost her vote, and obviously the others figure it out when there are less votes counted than they expected. During the deadlock, Daniel throws her under the bus, trying to blame her for the Lydia vote, and while he's technically correct, it appears to be a bad look on Daniel as well, and ultimately she doesn't get her way and Jenny goes home. So overall, obviously Daniel gets a ton of focus for his bad gameplay and edit in this episode, which is pretty well deserved. But Chanel also plays this round terribly and got a negative edit as well. First, it's the summit, where we get no personal content from her at all. Granted, you could argue that she and Omar will not be an important relationship moving forward, and that any content she'd gotten or would have gotten there would have been circumstantial at best. But the fact that she doesn't even get that content when, again, it is circumstantial, is pretty bad. Then, despite her talking about how important it is for her to have her vote going into tribal, she decides to risk her vote and it ultimately backfires on her. And it's sort of crazy how she decides to do that, where she should have realized that she needed her vote at any cost. She had zero reason to risk it, as the benefit of getting an extra vote is rarely worth the risk of not having one at all. And this is obviously true in this situation. She should have recognized that Omar is probably going to risk his vote, as he assumes that she is going to keep it safe, as she knows she is going to tribal and will try to keep her vote accordingly. So I think that was a miscalculation on her part. I also think she gets a negativity back at camp, where she clearly has some second thoughts on her decision, prompting her to frantically throw out split vote plans. Now, I'm not too sure what she was trying to get out of these split vote plans, especially if the thought of not having a vote was weighing on her. Maybe she was banking on a 2-to-1 vote, with Hai and Daniel voting Mike, Lydia voting Jenny, and Jenny voting Lydia. And on the chance she did keep her vote, she votes for Lydia, causes a tie, and then the Alliance votes for out Jenny on the revote. That's my best guess, but even then, I feel like she would have been better off trying to make it a straight line vote to minimize the impact of her potential no vote really screwing things up, especially if she knows that Mike's idol is useless right now. So obviously, if she doesn't have a vote, that would mean there will only be 4 votes being cast. Instead, she tells Daniel to vote Lydia, which Daniel uses to make her a scapegoat during the deadlock. And while I think Daniel plays the entire tribal worse than Chanel, Chanel still caused the situation by needlessly risking her vote, and I feel like she isn't in the best position either. Now, granted, the main reason I have her above Daniel is that, well, one, her negativity isn't as overstated as Daniel's is, and I also feel like she isn't likely to be targeted next over Daniel. Now, obviously, Daniel could change that, but I feel like Chanel should be in the clear at least for the next round. Well, obviously, what happens if they vote out Daniel and have to go to tribal again, we'll have to see. But this is still a pretty bad episode for Chanel. I feel like people are focusing a bit too much on Daniel, which again, well deserved, but we also have to remember that Chanel also had a bad episode here, and I feel like it really kills a lot of her winning chances. So because of that, I don't have her too much higher than Daniel. She's here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and this person moved up quite a bit from last week. Last week, I felt like this person was pretty low in my estimation, and to be fair, I still feel like they are pretty low. However, I feel like the fact that they are on what I consider the complex tribe of the season is enough to propel them forward. And here we have Lindsay. And I feel like, again, Lindsay didn't get that much in episode 3. I mean, with her having a confession about her, Omar, and Jonathan voting together at the last tribal, and she's pleased by that. Even though she notes that Marianne mentioned her extra vote at their tribal, she hopes that if Taku sticks together, they can be a tight group. And again, I feel like the main reason I have Lindsay this high is because I feel like, again, through 3 episodes, she's had a relatively consistent presence. I wouldn't say it was too present, but it's still somewhat consistent. And I feel like she is on the complex tribe, where I feel like Taku has a lot of top contenders at this point, as people are starting to notice. And I feel like through that really elevates Lindsay's edit and her chances in my eyes. Now, admittedly, I also feel like she could be in Tori territory, where I feel like she has a lot of potential to be the merge boot as well, especially if Marianne were to flip. However, I feel like through these first 3 episodes and me just understanding Taku more and more, and me just getting higher on Taku as a tribe, I feel like that in turn elevates each of the members of Taku, including Lindsay. So I feel like that's enough to have her this high. However, I'm still not feeling great about her. I feel like she doesn't really have much of a story. She doesn't have too much personal content. And I feel like there is enough there to make me think she could be a merge boot or early merge boot. So because of that, I only have her here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7. And we're actually wrapping up the other 2 Ika members here, as it's sort of crazy that I have them this high despite them not getting any content this episode. But I feel like these 2 are the most likely to have a deep run in them, even though I'm not feeling too great in the grand scheme of things. But at number 7, we have Drea. And I feel like Drea has the most potential to make a deep run on this season. I feel like obviously she doesn't get much content here, but you could at least excuse that with her not going to tribal. And I feel like she has just enough in these first 2 episodes to establish her as a pretty big player. Obviously, she has her advantages that I feel like will be pretty significant later on. So I have no doubt that Drea is going to be a big player. However, she's probably not going to win. I feel like the edit has just not been there for her. It's sort of weird comparing her to other big players from recent seasons, such as Shan, who people have noticed over time has sort of deteriorated. Here, I feel like Drea has a lot of that same potential and trajectory, but obviously we just haven't gotten the content, and a lot of that you could excuse as saying, well, Ika hasn't gotten the tribal, whereas Shan from 41 was on the tribe that went to tribal all the time. So I feel like there's enough there to excuse Drea, but I still feel like she's going to win. So because of that, I only have her here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have the other Ika member left on the board. We have Swati. And Swati is a weird one still. Again, she got no content this episode, and I said before how it's unclear where her edit is going at this time. I'm not sure if she's going to be a pre-merge boot by her trying to take a shot at Drea only to fail, or if it's her being set up for a relatively deep run. Obviously, she got that content in the premiere, which is a big reason I have her this high on the list. I feel like her having that content in the premiere, that personal content, and her sort of getting credit for a lot of the vote that happened there is a big reason I have her as high as she is. However, I'm still not entirely sure where her edit is going per se. I feel like the premiere did enough to establish her as a big character, someone who's probably in it for a decent amount if Drea doesn't go after her. Like it really depends on what happens if he could goes back to tribal. Like I feel like of the people there, I had the most confidence in Swati and Drea to have deep runs, even if they don't necessarily get there together. It's just a matter of what Swati will do after getting this far. And I'm not feeling too great about Swati either, if I'm being perfectly honest. But when we're comparing all the other Ika members, I feel like she's probably the most set up to do well. And if she is able to get out Drea and sort of outlast her, then I feel like she has a lot of potential to maybe win. However, I don't think it's super likely. So because of that, I only have her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5. And we have another person who took a pretty big step forward, largely due to the tribe that they're on, but also because of my general confidence in them. And here we have Jonathan. And admittedly, I still have a lot of the same issues with Jonathan that I had before. I feel like he hasn't gotten a ton of personal content, and I also feel like just him as a player is someone who's probably going to be targeted in the post merge, where obviously we see during this immunity challenge, he single-handedly carries his tribe to victory there, where obviously the other tribes weren't even able to collect their keys because of how intense the waves were. It wasn't really much of an issue for Jonathan. And I feel like that was his main content in this episode. Aside from that, not too much. Now, Jeff did praise him a bit for being like a complete challenge beast here, which is something at least. And I feel like, obviously, as time goes on, we are starting to establish Taku as a pretty tight pairing of people. Like maybe Marianne may not be in it per se, but certainly the other 3 of Jonathan, Lindsay, and Omar. And I feel like through that, that's definitely something that will benefit Jonathan quite a bit. Now, admittedly, I know plenty of people are high on Jonathan and they have criticized me for not necessarily having him higher in the list. And I can see the argument for him maybe being a winner. However, I feel like the biggest knock, aside from like his archetype in general, is the fact that obviously we got in the premiere this talk about him, the need for there to be a well-rounded winner. Like there's a sense that the winner of the season is someone who's going to be well-rounded, good physically, good socially, good strategically. And we literally saw in episode 2, Jonathan saying that he is only good physically and that he sees Omar as someone that compliments him. And to me, that's not the greatest look at the end of the day. I mean, if that is the theme of the season, the winner is someone who is well rounded, I feel like that's definitely something that doesn't help Jonathan. However, admittedly, he hasn't been portrayed too negatively at the end of the day. I mean, we still have that relationship pretty solid at this point of him and Omar, and I feel like through that, that's definitely something that can help him. And plus, despite him maybe being targeted later on in the game for being a physical threat, I mean, we clearly saw in this episode just how capable he is physically, so he can win challenges if he needs to. So that's definitely something in his favor, at least. However, I'm still not as sold on him as maybe some other people are. We'll have to see how we are going to be moving forward in the season with Taku. However, it's the fact that he is on Taku and just me just having more time to process everything that has allowed me to move Jonathan quite a bit up on this list. So because of that, I have him here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and admittedly, I'm still not feeling great about this person, but I feel like this was another pretty good episode for them, and here we have Hai. And I feel like Hai is doing pretty well in the game so far, where obviously in episode 3, he has a confessional about the importance of Daniel and Lydia to vote together in taking out Jenny, tries proposing to split vote 3 on Jenny, 1 on Mike, has a confession about how frazzled Chanel seems, given how she's throwing out multiple split vote plans. Obviously, they eventually agreed to a plan to put 2 votes on Jenny, particularly the women, and 2 votes on Mike, both them being the men. Obviously, Hai voting for Mike. However, this doesn't really add up to him. Ultimately, he says before Tribal he needs to trust his gut. Now, if I recall correctly, like I said, he was assigned to vote for Mike at the Tribal, but Daniel gives away during Tribal that he was closer to Mike, prompting him to flip his vote to Jenny, and with Chanel not having a vote, it goes to a tie. After the deadlock, he's one of the 2 people that can vote, and he refuses to flip on Lydia. Ultimately, he gets his way, Daniel capitulates, he gets his way, Jenny goes home. And overall, this was an alright episode for Hai, like I said. I think the biggest hole in his edit is that he didn't get to talk about his alliance sooner, but, better late than never, I guess. I also like how he picked up that Chanel was frazzled after the summit, indicating that the vote may not go according to plan, and he gets a decent amount of content at Tribal with him reacting to Daniel's flip. For the most part, I think he handles the deadlock pretty well with him owning up to his Jenny vote and coming off as the more honest and trustworthy person in this situation. And I think him committing to Lydia and being rewarded for it follows up with the confessional earlier in the episode of him trusting his gut. Now, granted, I think him getting his way is more a result of Daniel's poor gameplay than anything overly impressive on Hai's end, but it's still impressive nonetheless. And I think now Hai is in a solid spot. Now, it isn't great that he needed twists to come into play, particularly Mike and Chanel losing their votes to get that strong position. But at this point, he and Lydia are essentially the swing votes if Vadi ever goes back to Tribal. And obviously with him getting mostly positive content here or there, that's obviously pretty good for Hai. Now, he isn't a top contender for me. I feel like there are still plenty of issues with his edit. I feel like the fact that he didn't get much personal content until episode 2 was a bit of a worry. And, again, also the fact that, he didn't get to talk much about his alliance until then. I found that a bit concerning as well. But I still feel pretty good about him. I feel like Hai is probably in it for the long haul. I don't see how he goes up pre-merge if I'm being perfectly honest. And with him having a pretty good round here, I feel like that's enough to put him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3. And I feel like this person had a mostly good episode. Now I have been pretty low on them in terms of them actually winning despite them being relatively high on the winner ranking. But here we have Marianne. And I feel like this was an alright episode for Marianne, where obviously it's revealed she told everyone about her extra vote after the Tribal, which seems to go pretty well for the most part, has a confessional while idol hunting, and knows how she's seen every episode of Survivor, except for 6 episodes of Tokensheens, which feels pretty random, but whatever. Sure enough, she finds the Beware advantage for Taku, which means she's unable to vote for the time being. She says she would rather take a risk and flame out than not do anything and regret it. I feel like that's a pretty good line from her, as while I did criticize Chanel earlier for taking a risk that was unnecessary, I feel like Marianne taking a risk here is portrayed pretty positively. We saw that back during her visit to the summit, where she obviously talked about taking risks there and not paying off. And obviously now here with her getting the Beware advantage, I feel like that's something that can definitely help her out. She obviously reveals her advantage to the rest of the tribe, who take it pretty well. And she's shown saying the phrase during the challenge, which I found pretty interesting. So I feel like on the whole, Marianne did get a pretty good episode despite her losing her vote, and technically her extra vote as well, by opening the Beware advantage. it'll be interesting to see how she manages. Now, I do think from a game perspective, she's still in a pretty bad position. I feel like if Taku goes back to tribal, she's more than likely the boot there. However, I feel like, as I explained earlier, Taku is a complex tribe, and I feel like there's enough talk of them being a four-person unit to where they probably aren't going to go back to tribal before the merge. Now, after the merge, who knows what could happen? I mean, Marianne could flip. She could try to use her advantage to maybe get herself into a better position. So I don't think her staying with Taku all the way through will be necessarily great for her game, but I feel like the edit does suggest longevity for her and really all of Taku. So I feel like that's enough to have her here at number 3. However, it's not really enough to have her a top contender. Now we're moving on to number 2, and I did wonder last week if I had this person too high in my ranking. However, I feel like after this episode, I feel pretty good about it, and here we have Mike. And I feel like this was a good episode for Mike, despite not being the best gameplay wise. So in episode 3, he calls Mike neurotic for wanting to read the note with the idol. Even so, he agrees to give the note to Daniel. After reviewing it, Daniel decides to spare him, as voting him out wouldn't eliminate the idol. But when Daniel hands it back, he observes that the idol in the note had gone missing. While it seemed at first that he was hallucinating, it turns out Daniel did drop it, proving Mike right. At the challenge, he has a confessional about Marianne saying her phrase and how he hopes to wait until the other two people say their phrases first, or possibly wait until the merge, at which point the idol would be activated anyway. He hopes to go on as long as possible without people learning about his idol. Jenny tells him about the Lydia plan after the challenge, but admits that he's nervous about Daniel, and obviously he ends up being proven right, as Daniel does flip on him at the end of the day. And overall, like I said, this wasn't a great episode for Mike gameplay-wise, as Daniel does flip on him, sending out his closest ally in Jenny, and with the Ika Beware advantage not being found yet, he's still unable to vote. Despite this, I actually think this was a good episode for Mike edgically. Now, the main storyline this episode is Daniel screwing up, between losing Mike's idol, his flip being exposed at tribal, and him burning bridges to avoid rocks. And through the episode, we see Mike weighing in on Daniel and being right about him. When Mike notices that the idol is missing, he calls Daniel out for it, and while Daniel questions whether Mike was imagining it, he ultimately admits that Mike is correct. Later on, we hear Mike say that he's nervous about Daniel and he might break away from the plan, and ultimately that's what happens. We see Mike kind of being nervous about Daniel and then having that belief being reinforced, despite Daniel having a pretty positive edit on the whole. So I feel like despite Mike not doing well gameplay-wise in this episode, and again, I feel like the power is sort of shifted over to the Hai and Lydia duo, this episode is still going out of its way to show Mike being correct, and I feel like that's definitely something that will help Mike out in the long term. Furthermore, I just love that confessional at the immunity challenge of him talking about his strategy of not sharing the phrase, and I feel like that's just a big character moment for him, but also an interesting game moment for him. So I'm still pretty high on Mike. Now I can see some people trying to say that this is a negative for him. Obviously, we'll have to see what happens from here. But I just feel pretty good about Mike. I feel like he is a top contender for me. The main reason I don't have him at number 1, however, is 1, I feel like he is not on the complex tribe. And 2, there's still that concern in my back of my head that he may just be a big character who's being overexposed right now, maybe not translating to a win. But we really just have to see what happens. But I feel like considering what we've gotten so far from Mike, I feel like there is enough there to justify him being a top contender. And because of that, I feel like I have to put him here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I think is the most likely to win Survivor 42 right now is Omar. And I know it's the same number 1 as I had last week. And honestly, this wasn't even the best episode for him, but it's not as negative as it seems on the surface. So in episode 3, Marianne shares a Beware advantage with him. After the immunity challenge, he's selected to go on the summit, talks to Chanel during the summit about the decision, has a confessional about how much communication is made non-verbally. He says that he trusts Chanel and doesn't think she's sneaky, speculates that Chanel wants to protect her vote since they're going to tribal. Ultimately, he risks his vote, but because Chanel, against his judgment, also risks her vote, he will be unable to vote at the next tribal. And overall, obviously, it wasn't great that he lost his vote here. Obviously, there's also a bit of negativity in the sense that he assumed that Chanel would be playing it safe and that he thought he could trust her, only for her to do something that screws him over. So that's not great. However, I feel like that's more so negative on Chanel than it is on Omar. It's still not ideal, but I feel like it's still not enough to really take him out of contention for me. And I feel like the main reason I have him in number one is that to me at least, he is on the complex tribe, and I feel like that's something that really elevates him a lot. I've liked the content he's gotten the first two episodes, and while this wasn't the best episode for him, honestly, it's not really enough to take him out of contention. And like I said, I feel like it's more so a knock on Chanel than it is on Omar. I feel like he will be able to get back from this somehow, so we'll have to see what happens. But and honestly, I know some people feel like Omar is a bit too obvious of a winner contender, and I recognize that too. And honestly, I am kind of looking for reasons to not have Omar number one. However, I feel like despite Omar having holes in his edit, I feel like other people have holes in their edits as well that really makes it hard for me to have them above him. So I feel like until it becomes really clear to me that Omar isn't winning, I feel like number one is the place I have to put him. I feel like he still remains the most conventional winner contender, and despite having some negativity, I feel like there's enough going for him to have him here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's Power Rankings. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. If you, like I said, I'll be updating these Power Rankings again next week, so stay tuned for that. I'll also be covering Australian Survivor, although that's wrapping up soon. I am still covering Big Brother Canada, which has been a lot of fun at this point, so we'll have to see what happens with all these shows. Obviously, if you like it, again, if you like this content, like and subscribe. Again, I really appreciate all of your support and making this channel possible. But for now, that is the video. See ya.